That was a very, very telling statement. I read about the Soviet space program was fully automated. And when Buzz Aldrin made that statement that we were just passengers, I mean, he said that under some emotional stress. And when you're under emotional stress, you tend to let out answers that you're not supposed to let out.
Yeah.
And when he said that, that was a very interesting, very telling, very revealing remark that he made.
Yeah.
It could be taken in several different ways, actually.
Yeah, and one assumed that he was a passenger on the way to the moon.
Yeah.
That's an assumption. There's no evidence that they were on their way to the moon.
For him to say that they were just passengers, there was something more about that. When he said we were just passengers, it felt like we were just doing what we were told to do is what I think he really wanted to say. That's the way I was sort of interpreting it.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's made some other blunders in the last couple of decades along the way. I'm not out to denigrate Buzz Aldrin by any means. I know he's had some problems with alcohol and some depression, and that's nothing to laugh at. We all know somebody who has experienced that, and it should be taken very seriously. And I think you would agree with me on this, and I know that Scott Henderson himself has talked about this as well in terms of the pressure that they were under and the commitments that they had agreed to, maybe reluctantly. I mean, if you look at the Apollo 11 press conference, I mean the post-Apollo 11 press conference, it is an exercise in futility just by looking at it. I mean, it is incredible. They strain to smile occasionally through that whole. I watched the whole press conference, and I was embarrassed just watching it, and I think a lot of people were embarrassed watching it. I mean, there were gestures, eye movements, body language. There was Neil Armstrong was making a comment about he couldn't see the stars unless they looked through the optics, and then that was apparently a mistake for some reason, because then Michael Collins turns to him and says, well, I don't remember seeing any stars at all. And then Neil Armstrong says something to the effect that under his breath, just let it go. And then he kind of moves his elbow like that. Now, if you look at the photo head on, he's nowhere near. He's quite distant. He's about a foot away. So when we say that he was elbowing him to shut up, and the proponents are quick to say, well, he wasn't doing that, but it was the gesture. Yeah. He made that gesture. It was a signal with his elbow to, okay, let it go. Let's stop this, right, and move on to the next subject. They weren't touching. There's two shots. You see them on an angle, and it has the illusion that they're sitting very close together. But when you look at them from the front, they're actually distant apart. I think they were about a foot apart. So he didn't really hit him with his elbow, but it was a gesture nonetheless.
Yes.
And that's what I noticed, because that was a mistake. And I also noticed that, if I'm not mistaken, that particular dialogue between Michael Collins and Neil Armstrong was reversed in the official transcript of that press conference, which is not a mistake. That was done on purpose to give the illusion, because why would Michael Collins be saying that, talking, so he didn't have their lines correct, they weren't in sync. He was talking about the lunar surface, and I guess the question was from Patrick Moore, the astronomer, could you see the stars in spite of the sun's corona? And apparently they got their messages mixed up on that point. I think one was talking about the lunar surface, and the other one was talking about, well, I didn't see it either, or something like that. So it was very interesting watching it.
Yeah, it was yet another example of how things can be manipulated, and were manipulated. In fact, to an extent, I feel quite sorry for some of those Apollo astronauts, because they've had to live with this. They must know in their heart of hearts that they didn't do what was claimed for them. Yeah. They didn't walk on the lunar surface.
No.
Because they couldn't. There wasn't sufficient air in the oxygen tanks. I mean, 7 hours, 56 minutes on Apollo 17 on one of the EVAs. Any scuba diver would love to have that amount of air available to them.
Well, talk about stretching it. Incredible. Yeah.
I mean, most air is about 45 minutes. Maybe a bit more for some scuba divers. It depends on the tanks. If you get rebreathers, you can get a little bit more, but not 8 hours. That is what's so ridiculous. And then you've got the ridiculous scene of the lunar rover. Oh dear. Lunar bloody rover. They take a car up there. It weighs, on Earth, that thing weighs 450 pounds. On Earth. How much extra fuel would it be required to launch that into lunar orbit?
You know what, Marcus, that's a very good question. And Scott Henderson also mentioned that in terms of the weight and balance of the lunar module. Yeah, it's a vacuum, but you still need proper weight and balance, and you still have to deal with 1/6 gravity, lunar surface. So you need weight and balance in proportion to its flight path. And they had to remove something in the descender part of the lunar module to fit the rover in, and with that the rover wouldn't fit, so they had to fold it. I mean, there's just all kinds of incredible things that supposedly work perfectly. When you break it down bit by bit by bit by bit, you actually see it. And I think it was Bart Sabril in our HBO interview when he said, if people will just detach themselves emotionally from all of this, they would see it for themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a very good point. You mentioned earlier the 850 pounds of moon rock that were brought back. And I mentioned that in book, yes, yeah, and you have one.
I got a piece of moon rock.
It's a collector's item.
It's worth about $1 million. I mean, it's quite big, you know. Come on, NASA, come and get it. Basically, you know where it is, NASA, if you want it back.
And it's interesting, I talk about that, and I did get into the actual mineral base, the construction of the moon rock versus what you find on Earth. And from my understanding, a lot of it's similar. Another thing I understand too, and this NASA keeps changing its narrative, well, there's no liquid on the moon and you won't find any liquid. Well, apparently there is, so you would find it. So it's very similar to what you would find on Earth, but that's another issue. I came at it from a different angle, and I was trying to figure out, okay, you say you brought back 850 pounds of moon rock, so instead of just doing the math per 6 missions, just divide it up, it works out to about 140 pounds on the average per mission. Now, all the weights were different. I think it was like 70 pounds on Apollo 11. I think it was like 200 pounds of rock on Apollo 17, something like that. Don't quote me on that. I haven't got the exact figures, but it was something like that. I was kind of thinking, well, that's almost equivalent to another person on board.
Yeah, it would.
And that would affect your re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, because then you have atmospheric forces that need to be taken into account. And how is that going to affect your weight and balance? And if you're not precise in terms of your weight and balance, and for the readers that don't know of my books, the weight and balance is common with every aircraft and rocket. The weight has to be distributed properly, all right, to deal with the forces in an atmosphere or in gravity. So how would they compensate for that on re-entry? Because once they re-enter Earth's atmosphere, as you said, you know, almost at 25,000 miles per hour from a lunar corridor, a lunar entry. I know low Earth orbit entry is a little slower, but from a lunar corridor, it's about close to 25,000 miles per hour. I don't think it's quite, but it's close to it. How would that affect their weight and balance? Was the Apollo guidance computer capable of making the necessary adjustments and firing the thrusters necessary? Because if that angle changes when they're surrounded by plasma during re-entry, they're in serious trouble. And that has never really been explained. They say, oh, the Apollo guidance computer was capable of this and this and this. Well, I look into it and I haven't seen that. And furthermore, how well would the thrusters around the command module on re-entry, how effective would they have been surrounded by plasma? Yeah.
And also, there's another point, just so almost aside from that. If you look at any photograph of an Apollo command module, which is on display, the Apollo 11 command module, I think, is at the Air and Space Museum. It's been renovated. There's one in London, the Apollo 10 command module, which didn't land, but it still came back, brought the astronauts back from July 68, I think it was. Anyway, if you look at any of those command modules, you will see on the outside of the command module grab handles. They're made of aluminium. There are about 3 or 4 of them, so that as an astronaut was getting out, because they had to get out to collect their camera footage from the service module, which had been allegedly photographing the lunar surface as they orbited it, the astronaut had to get out to recover the films, don't forget, in space. And they have these grab handles. Now, they're made of aluminium, which melts at about 600 degrees centigrade. Don't you think that at a re-entry speed generating a heat of about 3,000 degrees centigrade, it might have melted a few aluminium grab handles on the outside of the craft? Of course it would.
Good point.
So what the hell are they doing there?
Yeah. And they look pristine, like it looked like they just rolled out of the garage, right, the assembly line after re-entry.
Exactly. And any Soyuz craft returning from the International Space Station is black.
Black and scorched.
Yeah, it's scorched. And coming, as you say, coming from the International Space Station, you're coming back at 17,500 miles an hour.
Yeah.
If you increase the speed by 50% to 25,000 miles an hour, which is the re-entry speed from lunar orbit, you generate twice the amount of kinetic energy.
Yes.
It's the inverse square law. It's that simple.
Absolutely. In fact, before then, they were doing with unmanned spacecraft. I researched this and I put this in the chapter, I think it's chapter 5, my second book. Those temperatures can reach temperatures greater than the surface of the sun on re-entry.
Very hot.
Yeah, we're talking some serious temperatures here. But I just want to clarify, you were talking about, when you mentioned that, was that an observation by Emmanuel Garcia, I believe?
Yes, I think it was. Yes.
Yeah, he, by the way, for the readers, a lot of what we've been talking about in this video, I put an appendix, I've added an appendix to book 2. And Appendix A, I discuss Marcus Allen's work. Appendix B, Robert Williams. And Robert Williams is the one who owns the YouTube channel. And he's also written a paper and done some really good work on the vacuum of space. It was co-written by Marcus Allen and Scott Henderson. I talk about another author who made some very interesting observations, T.J. Heglin. He brought up a very good point about the size of the moon. When you look at the moon from the Earth's surface versus looking at the Earth from the lunar surface, and I wrote an appendix on that. It was a very interesting observation on his part. And of course, Scott Henderson is in there in the appendix section, and I put a few photos in there. And Phil Kautz, Phil Kautz, am I saying that right? Phil Kautz has done some very excellent work. And of course, there is a section on Manuel E. Garcia, MD. Now, the reason why I mentioned him when you were talking about the aluminum handles, I don't actually talk about that part in there. I talk about some of the other papers he has written. Emmanuel Garcia has written some very good papers on psychology aspect of it as well. Yeah. So I thought that would be just worth mentioning for the reader.
Yeah. Just one point. You mentioned Robert Williams, who's done some fantastic work.
Yeah.
His YouTube channel is called Apollo Detectives. So just punch in Apollo Detectives into YouTube, not into Google. You'll come up with his YouTube channel. Let's see a picture of Robert. He's quite a private person. He's a very good editor. He's a good compiler of information. And he has as much interest, if not more, than we do in basically exposing the anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained details of Apollo. That's what we do. We ask questions.
Yes.
And if there are good answers to those questions, great. Look forward to receiving them. But if there aren't good answers to those questions, we want to know why. And we want to know what NASA have done to overcome several problems we've identified.
Yeah.
I mean, your work on the F1 engine and the Saturn V rocket and the launch of it and the speed of it, I think is excellent. It demonstrates that the Saturn V rocket could not have done what NASA claimed for it.
No. And a lot of that work, too, a lot of my information came from, well, it was a very good source on the Alles.com website. Ivanko Gennady, if I'm saying his name correctly, a Russian scientist, and he's done some really good work. And then a lot of also came from official documents and books written supporting the Apollo missions. And I just want to mention briefly a bit of a call out to Bill Kaysen, because he was really the first one to draw attention to the F1 engines. He worked at Rocketdyne, the manufacturer who built the F1 engines, or who got the contract. It was actually, I think, started by the Air Force, but they took it over.
Yeah.
In 1958. He worked from 1958 to 1963. And he's been slammed a lot. Well, he was just basically a technical reader. He wasn't an engineer, but he was obviously qualified enough, according to Rocketdyne rather, to be hired to work for their corporation to analyze the data, the F1 engines. And he was seeing data that didn't add up. I think he actually alluded to, if not outright said it, was falsified, right? And a lot of and I just want to mention this other point about the F1 engines is a lot of the data itself up to 1959, there was no reason to hide it at that point, because they didn't know what those engines were going to be used for. Because remember, the Apollo program wasn't announced until President John F. Kennedy, when he announced it in 1961. They did reach a point where they got full power for less than a second with the F1 engine, and that's it. So any data that comes from those F1 engines from 1961, 62, 63 on would be part of the telemetry data, the telemetry tapes that have gone missing or are actually being destroyed, right? Yeah. So you can't trust any of that data because the proponents will say, yeah, but that information has been printed out. Okay, but where's the source of that information? Where's the original source? And that's gone. And NASA was doing computer simulations anyway. So all of that information, the F1 engines, the performance of the Saturn V rocket, so on and so forth, was all on those 140,000 reels of telemetry tapes that have since disappeared, right? Yes. So I just wanted to mention that because Bill Kaysen was the first one to bring attention to that in his excellent book in 1976, 1977, I believe, when it was first released. Yeah. And he was ridiculed for decades and decades. And now it turns out, he's been vindicated because he was right all along. We're all seeing it now.
It's interesting you say that he was vilified for what he originally said. His book, it was self-published in, I think, 1977, 78, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle. It was another 16 years before Ralph Rene published his next book, which is the next book on the subject of Apollo, called NASA Mooned America.
Yeah.
Which is still, both of those books are still available.
Yes.
That was followed 7 years after that by Dark Moon, which is probably the definitive book on the subject.
Very good.
500 pages. And your books now, and Trevor Weaver's books now. The amount of information, which you've already mentioned on the Aulis website, aulis.com website, there's more information goes up there all the time. And there's some very, very good work. This is, one could call it peer-reviewed, insofar as a lot of people check it out. And if there are mistakes in there, they'll get corrected. That's what peer review is about. We're not talking about pal review, where your friends agree this is the right thing to write. Pal review is what destroys science. Peer review is what supports science.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Just one point on people who attack those who ask questions about Apollo. If even half what we are saying is correct, that there are problems with radiation in space, there are problems with the vacuum in space, there are problems with humans surviving in space, there are problems getting rockets into space in the way that we have been told they got the rockets into space. There are problems with that. Why haven't any of the scientists here on Earth, the photographers, the biologists, the astrobiologists, the physicists, the scientists who know about the information, why haven't any of them come forward? Not necessarily I agree with this bunch of kooks who are continually having a crack at NASA, but this is a scientifically based question. Why haven't they come forward to say it? The point is they have. Quite a few of them have already done that. Yeah. I'm in contact with quite a few people who are fairly quiet, don't want a lot of publicity, but have seen what I've had posted on YouTube, posted online, stories that come out through social media. I can't dispute what you say, is quite often what they'll start off by saying. And then they'll maybe come up with a few pointers to indicate that maybe I was wrong. I don't say I'm 100% correct. I say, if what I say is not correct, please give me the information so I can correct it. Yeah. Because I want NASA to be correct when they say we can send humans to the lunar surface and return them safely to the Earth. That's all I want. I'm old enough to have watched it live on television when it happened.
So am I.
I don't believe it was live because the ability to transmit over distance, 240,000 miles, requires considerably more power than was contained in the batteries in the Apollo lunar module. 4 kilowatts is not enough to transmit a television signal across 240,000 miles even at 10 frames per second. So nobody's going to say, oh, they only did it at 10 frames per second. Yeah, they did. And then it was corrected back to 24 frames per second for transmission on terrestrial television. That's what we're told. But the way that the whole thing was done, somebody said, well, if what you say is correct, Marcus, and you may well be correct in certain aspects, how did they fake all the pictures? How did they fake all the films? Because there are hundreds of hours of television film that you can go onto the NASA website and download for any aspect of any mission. It's explained in a remarkable film released about 5 years ago called Make Believe, Smoke and Mirrors. It's nearly 3 hours long. It goes into incredible detail about how the whole thing was done. I'm not saying Hollywood was involved. Certain individuals who may have worked in the Hollywood film industry were certainly capable of creating the miniature sets, the models, the mannequins, using cameras which appear to give the correct perspective and putting it on film. If you look at the special effects in, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey, or in Blade Runner, or in Back to the Future, these were all miniatures and models. They were not CGI, hadn't been invented then. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a remarkable achievement of special effects. We genuinely believe they're in space, or on the moon, or going to Jupiter. We genuinely believe it because the effects are so brilliant. So Stanley Kubrick did not necessarily have anything to do with it, but his special effects director may well have done, as may well the special effects director on Star Wars. So these are things which need to be answered. Now, any special effects expert, and there are probably people now who are used to using CGI and blue screens or green screens, if you have used models and periscope cameras and the special effects that are produced on some of the more remarkable films from about 50 years ago, come forward and explain how it was done if it was not done using models. You mentioned earlier Ron Howard's film starring Tom Hanks of Apollo 13. That gave a realistic impression of going to the moon and not landing and coming back to Earth. That was all filmed here on Earth. In studios. If you've seen the film recently, I think it was called First Man, after a book of the same name, which is a biography of Neil Armstrong. First man presumably on the moon. That film was shot entirely in studios here on Earth. So Neil Armstrong is shown flying the X-15 rocket plane. He's shown in the Gemini 10, which had a malfunction in one of the control rockets, and he got it back under control. We're showing him landing on the lunar surface. It was all filmed here on Earth, so don't give me any stories, anybody, please, about you can't film realistic space scenes on Earth. Of course you can.
Exactly.
What you expect to see. The X-15 doesn't exist anymore, but we still saw some remarkable film of Neil Armstrong flying one to the edge of space. He was an astronaut before he joined NASA.
That's absolutely a good point, because I brought that up in book 2, that technically he and several other X-15 pilots had reached, by the American definition of where the boundary of space starts, not by the world definition, but technically by the American definition. I think it was 50 miles or something like that. And so they were designated the first astronauts. Decades later, they would designate the first astronauts in hindsight. But yeah, you're right.
There's a great deal of information out there. So come on, all you guys, all you scientists who are so clever. These people who stand up at conferences and pontificate about how wrong us hoax believers are. Come on, you're scientists. I mean, I've actually heard physicists from prestigious UK universities talking about space travel, talking about the pendulum effect of the flag on the moon. The flag wasn't blown by any wind. NASA are not stupid enough to leave the door open. The flag moved without anybody touching it. And if you measure the pendulum effect of the flag, it's the pendulum effect you would expect here on Earth. If it was a pendulum effect on the moon, it would be much slower. They completely missed that. So these physicists who claim knowledge of space physics, get your act together and get real about this. Apollo was fabricated. It was faked. It was a fraud. Prove me wrong.
And you know what's interesting, Marcus, too, is when you mention that, a PhD in physics comes out and says, what you just said, oh yeah, it was real. But if another physicist comes out and says the opposite, no, it wasn't real, then he's accused of not being qualified to speak to it. And then you would say, well, he has a PhD. Oh, yeah, but it's not in the area that is necessary to make that evaluation.
Yeah.
I mean, on and on and on it goes. And I could write a book on that alone, the comical responses from NASA proponents. Chapter 1, I mean, it's pretty funny. I give them credit for coming up with answers like that. It is appropriately should be written under the comical section.
In Trevor Weaver's third book, Exposing the Charlatans, he's just published it, and he actually goes through all the people who make these sort of comments. The physicists, the university professors, the curators of air and space museums who talk about this stuff. And he recounts what they say and then asks that question. Why have they got it so wrong? Surely these people should get it right. Now, the reason they probably get it wrong is, ironically, peer pressure.
Yeah.
Because if they came out and said, no, I'm not 100% sure that these Apollo missions happened the way we were told. If they say that, they're immediately labelled a conspiracy theorist.
Yes.
If you're a serious scientist, university tenured, serious scientist with PhD, preconceived hypothesis disorder after your name, you will get a lot of trouble. So they won't do it. They won't step over that barrier to be accused of conspiracy theorists. How many people know where the term conspiracy theorist originated? Mid-1960s, proposed by the CIA, the clowns in America, the CIA, to try to take pressure off the criticism of the Kennedy assassination story in the Warren Commission report.
Yes.
Because so many people were saying, no, it didn't happen that way. There's no way that a lone gunman achieved that particular shot. Didn't kill the president. The CIA, being establishment and part of the government, wanted to deflect attention. So anybody who came up with any story that contradicted the official narrative, the accepted narrative, was labelled a conspiracy theorist.
Absolutely.
And that is still happening today. People are still being labelled conspiracy theorists. Now, if you actually examine the word, and I've listened to somebody trying to explain conspiracy theorist, they get it so wrong because they say, well, a conspiracy is two or more people acting illegally. Now, that is the correct definition of the word conspiracy. They always omit to add the theory part. The theorist. What's a theorist? Somebody who proposes an idea. Could be right, could be wrong, doesn't matter. It's a theory. You put the two together. A conspiracy theorist is not somebody indulged in a conspiracy of illegal activity. It's somebody who is saying something could be wrong.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at it. I could be wrong, I could be right. This is what I'm saying now. I could be wrong, I could be right. I think I'm right. Nobody's ever disputed it. You've written 2 books on the subject. You've probably been called a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, actually, I get attacked all the time, especially on Facebook, from other people accusing me of a conspiracy theorist, so I always challenge them to a debate, and I never hear from them again.
Wonder why?
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, about the term conspiracy theory is that I get accused of being, you're a tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist. But here's the irony, and the irony is that, as you just pointed out, Marcus, that it was the CIA that invented the term conspiracy theory to deflect criticisms of the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination. So therefore, the tinfoil hat is really on the person accusing you, because they're the ones that are being manipulated by the CIA, not you or I or anyone else who's questioning it. Yeah. That's part of our existence. It's part of human history to question everything. This whole narrative now of questioning anything that is even hints at questioning the official narrative as applies to anything is no longer allowed. It's not tolerated. We will not put up with it. Do as we say and don't ask questions. Yeah. And so that narrative with the Apollo missions has now taken over our society, although I think that's going to come to an end soon. I'm seeing a lot of pushback on that, and which is good. And I think there's going to be a lot of pushback and some disclosure.